The year is 1945. Berlin, once a gleaming symbol of Nazi power, lies in ruins. Months of relentless bombing campaigns by Allied forces have reduced vast swathes of the city to smoldering rubble. The once proud German military, its delusional promises shattered by reality, crumbles in the face of the inevitable Soviet onslaught. Amidst the deafening roar of artillery fire and the ever-present smoke, German women navigate a world turned upside down. Their husbands, fathers and sons, sent off with promises of glory and a swift victory, are now either dead, missing, or returning as broken shells of the men they once knew. The societal structures that dictated their lives, the staunchly patriarchal Nazi regime, are disintegrating around them, leaving a vacuum of authority and a chilling uncertainty about the future, with their fate in the hands of the Red Army.
Let's unveil the secrets of time.
After the fall, survival in a ruined city. The fall of Berlin wasn't just a military defeat, it was a profound societal collapse. Food supplies dwindled to near non-existence. Infrastructure lay in ruins, leaving basic necessities like water and electricity scarce. The German healthcare system, crippled by the war effort, struggled to cope with the deluge of wounded and sick. Women, traditionally relegated to the domestic sphere, were thrust into the role of primary providers. They scoured the bombed-out streets for scraps of food, braved the black market to find essential goods, and nursed their families back to health in makeshift shelters. This desperation extended beyond physical needs. The horrors of war had left a deep psychological scar on the nation. Many women grappled with the trauma of witnessing their cities destroyed, loved ones lost, and a future seemingly devoid of hope. Many homes were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, forcing thousands to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Women and children crowded into basements, cellars, and bomb shelters. Makeshift tents and huts sprang up in parks and open spaces. The collapse of public services compounded the hardship. Fire services, medical care, and sanitation systems were overwhelmed or non-operational. Piles of uncollected garbage contributed to the spread of disease, and the lack of clean water sources led to severe hygiene problems. Even before the fall of Berlin, the war had strained food supplies. Rationing had been in place for years, and the situation worsened dramatically as the city fell. The breakdown of transportation networks and the looting of remaining stores left many without access to basic sustenance. The rationing system, which had already been inadequate, became even more dysfunctional. Ration cards were still issued, but the promised supplies were rarely available. Long lines formed outside distribution centers, with people often waiting for hours only to receive meager portions of bread, potatoes, or canned goods. With official channels failing, a black market economy flourished. Women bartered whatever they had left, jewelry, family heirlooms, and clothing, for food. The black market was rife with exploitation, but it was often the only way to obtain essential supplies. Prices were exorbitant, and transactions were risky, as black marketeers operated outside the law and sometimes under threat of violence. Scavenging became a daily necessity. Women and children combed through the rubble for anything edible. Gardens, parks, and even cemeteries were searched for plants, berries, and roots. Some ventured into the countryside, risking encounters with hostile soldiers or bandits, to trade for fresh produce with farmers. Clean water was another critical concern. The city's water supply system had been severely damaged, and many wells and reservoirs were contaminated. Women had to find alternative sources of water, often traveling long distances to reach functioning pumps or natural water bodies. These sources were frequently overcrowded, and the quality of the water was questionable. Drinking contaminated water led to outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery and typhoid. Maintaining hygiene with such limited water supplies was nearly impossible, exacerbating the spread of illness. Women had to balance the need for drinking water with the need to wash themselves and their clothing, often prioritizing the former at the expense of the latter. While survival in the city was already a daunting challenge, German civilians, particularly women, faced an even greater threat: the Red Army. Cry of fear, the horrible fate of German women. For some Berliners, particularly those who had suffered under the Nazi regime, the Red Army's arrival brought a glimmer of hope. However, this hope was quickly overshadowed by fear as reports of violence and retribution began to emerge. Women were especially apprehensive, having heard rumors and stories of the Red Army's reputation for harsh treatment of civilians. The inability to communicate effectively with the Soviet soldiers left many women feeling isolated and powerless. Basic interactions, such as asking for water or food, became challenging and could easily lead to misunderstandings. Some women attempted to learn basic Russian phrases to bridge the gap, while others relied on gestures and body language. The cultural differences between the Soviet troops and Berlin's residents also played a significant role in shaping initial encounters. Soviet soldiers, coming from a war-torn country with a different social and cultural background, often viewed Berliners with suspicion and hostility. On the other hand, Berlin's residents, steeped in Nazi propaganda, harbored their own prejudices and fears about the Soviets. As the Red Army advanced, many women tried to hide or flee to avoid potential dangers. Women sought refuge in basements, attics, and makeshift shelters. These hiding places were often overcrowded and lacked basic amenities, but they provided a sense of security from the advancing troops. The roads were filled with debris, and the risk of encountering Soviet patrols was high. Despite these challenges, some women managed to escape to the countryside or to the homes of relatives in safer areas. Despite the prevalent fear and mistrust, some women attempted to make contact with Soviet soldiers, hoping for protection or assistance. These interactions, however, were often met with unspeakable brutality. The most harrowing aspect of the Red Army's occupation of Berlin was the widespread sexual violence perpetrated against German women. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million German women were sexually assaulted by Soviet soldiers during this period. In Berlin alone, it is believed that around 100,000 women were assaulted, with many of them subjected to repeated offenses. Some women were assaulted as many as 60 to 70 times, illustrating the extreme brutality of these acts.
We were afraid of the Russians. We knew what to expect from them. They came in the night, dragging women from their homes, from cellars, assaulting them in front of their families. No one was spared. Young girls, old women, pregnant women, they took everyone. The screams of the women echoed through the streets, a constant reminder of the horror we lived in.
The scale of sexual violence was unprecedented. Women of all ages, from young girls to elderly women, were targeted. The assaults occurred in homes, streets, makeshift shelters, and even hospitals. This violence was not only a physical assault, but also a profound psychological trauma that left lasting scars on the victims. The motivations behind the widespread sexual violence were complex. Revenge for the brutalities committed by the Nazis in the Soviet Union played a significant role. Additionally, the breakdown of military discipline, the dehumanizing effects of prolonged combat, and the pervasive culture of violence within the ranks of the Red Army contributed to the atrocities. Some women disguised themselves as elderly or infirm to avoid detection by Soviet soldiers. Wearing old clothes, using makeup to create the appearance of illness, and moving with a stoop were some of the methods used to create a convincing disguise.
Women in Berlin quickly learned to make themselves as unattractive as possible. We cut our hair short, wore multiple layers of clothing, and smeared dirt on our faces. But these efforts often proved futile. The soldiers were not deterred by appearances. They were driven by a savage need to dominate and humiliate. They attacked in groups, often drunk, their laughter ringing in our ears as they violated us.
In some cases, women negotiated with Soviet soldiers for protection. This could involve offering food, valuables, or even personal favors in exchange for safety. These negotiations were precarious and could easily turn dangerous if misinterpreted. Some Soviet soldiers did provide humanitarian assistance, offering food, medical care, or protection. But these rare acts of kindness were often overshadowed by the widespread violence. Tragedy of war, harrowing accounts of Red Army victims. Before the Red Army advanced into East Prussia, propaganda spread tales of male sexual violence to instill fear among German civilians and encourage greater sacrifices from both civilians and soldiers. As the Red Army progressed through Eastern Europe in 1945, stories of Soviet brutality, including murder, looting, and assault, became widespread. Consequently, when the Soviets entered East Prussia, many panicked refugees fled west. Those who stayed soon found these stories to be true. Renate Hoffmann, the wife of a German Luftwaffe officer stationed at Greifswald Air Base near Peenemünde, decided to head to Greifswald with a female friend and their children when the Soviets arrived in March 1945. On their way, they passed a house and
suddenly 3 Russian soldiers pointed their guns at us and forced us into the house. We realized right away that we had walked into a trap, and we knew what they had in store for us. We were separated. They put guns to our heads. Any attempt to defend ourselves meant certain death. The only thing you could do was to pretend you were a rock or dead. I don't want to talk about what happened next.
After assaulting her and her friend, the 3 Soviet soldiers departed from the house, allowing the women to eventually reach Greifswald. According to her information, 4 out of every 10 women in Greifswald, including those over 50 years old, had experienced sexual violence. On the 9th of April 1945, Königsberg was captured by the Red Army. As recounted by Hans von Lehndorff, a senior surgeon at a hospital in Königsberg, Soviet soldiers promptly engaged in looting, causing destruction to valuable drugs and equipment. Attempts to raise grievances with Soviet officers were unsuccessful. According to von Lehndorff, he felt dehumanized by the Soviets, who saw him merely as a target for theft. His testimony suggests that instead of stopping it, Soviet officers tolerated the assault of German women.
A couple of nurses who got in their way were seized and outraged from behind, and then released again, thoroughly disheveled before they realized what was happening. The older ones could hardly believe their senses. They went wandering aimlessly about the corridors. There was nowhere to hide, and fresh tormentors kept falling on them.
Gisela, who was 22 years old at the time, recounted her ordeal in East Prussia in an interview conducted years later.
The Soviet soldiers came to our town with a vengeance. We had heard stories of their brutality, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. They broke into our home one night, dragging my mother and me out into the street. My mother tried to protect me, but they beat her and threw her aside. They took me instead, multiple men, one after another. The pain was indescribable. After they were done, they left me there, bleeding and in shock. My mother held me, crying, but there was nothing she could do. I wanted to die. The shame, the guilt, it was too much to bear. I felt as though I had been robbed of my humanity, reduced to nothing more than a victim. We were left to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives, with no support, no recognition of what we had endured.
Another victim recounts,
"The first night I was taken by 3 soldiers. I cannot forget their faces, their voices, the smell of alcohol on their breath. I fought, but it was useless. They were too strong, too determined. The pain was excruciating, both physical and emotional. They left me bleeding and broken, and I knew it was only the beginning. I was immediately sexually assaulted by 5 Russians. The memories come back to you over and over again. You can never forget something like that. Sometimes after I talk about it, I sleep for a few hours and then wake up crying, screaming. You can never ever forget."
Following May 1945, incidents of sexual assault in Berlin decreased notably. Women took the lead in implementing most preventive measures. For instance, a female doctor hid young girls in an air raid shelter hospital, disguising it as a typhoid ward. Women who sought refuge in the upper floors of tall apartment buildings generally faced lower risks. as Soviet soldiers rarely ascended the stairs of Berlin's skyscrapers. One tragic aftermath of the widespread assaults in Berlin was self-harm. While placing self-harm within the context of male violence poses challenges, it's evident that many women chose to end their lives. However, German men were also implicated in many cases. "If you get raped, nothing is left to you but death," a teacher declares to a class of girls 2 days before the final collapse. More than half the students came to the anticipated conclusion, as expected of them, and drowned themselves and their lost honor in the nearest body of water. The largest mass suicide ever recorded in Germany occurred in the town of Demmin, where it's estimated that more than 1,000 Germans took their own lives. The retreating Wehrmacht had blown up the bridges over the Peene and Tollense rivers, which enclosed the town to the north, west, and south, thus blocking the Red Army's advance and trapping the remaining civilians. The Soviet units looted and burned down the town and committed sexual assaults and executions. Demmin's current chronicler, Gisela Zimmer, then 14 years old, recalls,
"My mother was also raped, and then, together with us and with neighbors, she hurried towards the Tollense River, resolutely prepared to jump into it. I realized only much later that I had held her back, that I had pulled her out of what may be called a state of trance to prevent her from jumping into the water. There were people, there was screaming, the people were prepared to die. Children were told, 'Do you want to live on? The town is burning. These and those are dead already. No, we do not want to live anymore.' And so people went mostly into the rivers. That made the Russians feel creepy too. There are examples where Russians too tried to pull people out or hinder them, but these hundreds of people they were unable to withhold, and the population here was extremely panicked."
Weeks after the mass suicide, bodies still floated in the rivers. Clothing and other belongings of the drowned formed a border along the river's banks, up to 2 meters wide. Many German men did nothing while women were being assaulted during the invasion. Traditionally, this inaction has been attributed to fear and cowardice. However, there might be additional reasons for their behavior. For over a decade, the identity of German men had been closely tied to images of aggression and triumph. The end of the war inevitably caused a crisis in this concept of masculinity. Their inability to respond with effective violence against the invading Soviets during the Battle of Berlin, their defeat and subsequent disarmament led to the collapse of other roles associated with this masculine identity, such as protecting their families. Notably, German men only exhibited culturally recognized forms of masculine behavior when they were authorized to collect firearms for the Soviet authorities. The anonymous author of A Woman in Berlin described her unique story. She was one of the few women who could also understand Russian. Because of this, she found herself in a prominent role as the interpreter and mediator between the Germans and the Soviets. She was tasked with requesting protection from a Soviet officer when 2 soldiers tried to assault a woman in the cellar where she and other residents of her apartment block were hiding. Although the officer provided protection, he did so reluctantly.
"Several times I heard the expression, Uka Stalina, by the order of Stalin. This order seems to mean that these things must not happen. Needless to say, they happen just the same, as the officer tries to convey to me with a shrug of his shoulders. One of the 2 reprimanded men contradicts.
So what? What did the Germans do with our women? My own sister."
This incident shows that Soviet soldiers often used vengeance as a justification for their assaults. Women repeatedly found themselves being punished for the atrocities committed by German men in the USSR. While sexual assault was a common occurrence, it is fair to note that the Soviet government officially condemned any type of abuse when it came to the liberated areas.
"Officers and men of the Red Army, we are entering the country of the enemy. The remaining population in the liberated areas, regardless of whether they're German, Czech, or Polish, should not be subjected to violence. The perpetrators will be punished according to the laws of war. In the liberated territories, sexual relations with females are not allowed. Perpetrators of violence and rape will be shot."
On the other hand, when the Yugoslav partisan politician Milovan Djilas complained about sexual assaults in Yugoslavia, Joseph Stalin reportedly stated that he should understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman or takes some trifle. On another occasion, when told that Red Army soldiers sexually maltreated German refugees, he reportedly said, "We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have their initiative." Nevertheless, there are no surviving records to prove that rape was legally sanctioned. A directive from the Military Council of the First Belarusian Front, authorized by Marshal Rokossovsky, mandated the immediate execution of looters and rapists at the scene of their crimes. Additionally, an order from Stavka on April 20, 1945, emphasized the importance of maintaining good relations with German civilians to reduce resistance and expedite the end of hostilities. There were also several arbitrary attempts to exert authority. For example, the commander of one rifle division is said to have personally shot a lieutenant who was lining up a group of his men before a German woman spread-eagled on the ground. This effort to minimize the assault, however, was more the exception than the rule. Following is an account from a former army officer. "We were young, strong, and 4 years without women. So we tried to catch German women and 10 men, 1 girl. There were not enough women. The entire population run from the Soviet army. So we had to take young, 12 or 13-year-old. If she cried, we put something into her mouth. We thought it was fun. Now I cannot understand how I did it. A boy from a good family. But that was me." A woman telephone operator from the Soviet army recalled,
When we occupied every town, we had first 3 days for looting and rapes. That was unofficial, of course, but after 3 days, one could be court-martialed for doing this. I remember one German woman laying naked with hand grenade between her legs. Now I feel shame, but I did not feel shame back then. Do you think it was easy to forgive them? We hated to see their clean, undamaged white houses with roses. I wanted them to suffer. I wanted to see their tears. Decades had to pass until I started feeling pity for them.
While serving as an artillery officer in East Prussia, Alexander Solzhenitsyn witnessed war crimes against local German civilians by Soviet military personnel. Of the atrocities, Solzhenitsyn wrote, "You know very well that we've come to Germany to take our revenge. Rescue or more suffering? German women in the hands of the Western Allies." For most women, survival became the primary concern. Many turned to exchanging favors for resources as a means of staying alive. In the immediate post-war period, the distinction between coercion and consensual exchange was often unclear. These actions can be viewed along a spectrum of male dominance, where altruistic exchanges, compliant behavior, and potentially consensual interactions overlapped with the ever-present threat of violence during the occupation. Many women navigated the harsh realities by infusing their interactions with an aura of romance, hoping to escape through marriage to American or British soldiers. Fiction from this era frequently depicts German women's aspirations to reach the Golden West via such unions. To what extent these relationships were consensual remains uncertain. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat, with the trauma of mass assaults fresh, genuine consent seems unlikely. However, as social dynamics stabilized, consensual unions became more plausible, though complicated by extreme power imbalances and the lingering threat of violence. If consensual sex is defined as mutual desire between partners, then some women did choose to engage with allied men, driven by mutual attraction, need, and the hope of escape. Women who fraternized with allied soldiers faced a difficult situation. They needed essential supplies like food, coal, and clothing, which could be obtained through sexual favors, but they also sought escape through marriage. Despite their efforts, these women often failed to achieve their goal due to the double standards of Western society, which branded them as prostitutes and unfit for marriage, compounded by the fact that many soldiers were already married. A married English private, for instance, remembered his affair with an 18-year-old German girl.
I felt a bit sick at times about the power I had over that girl. If I gave her a 3-penny bar of chocolate, she nearly went crazy. She was just like my slave. She darned my socks and mended things for me. There was no question of marriage. She knew that was not possible.
In many ways, the Western troops were in no way different to the Red Army. In Taken by Force, J. Robert Lilly estimates that US servicemen committed 11,040 sexual assaults in Germany. However, German historian Miriam Gebhardt suggests a much higher number of 190,000 by American soldiers. Reports indicate widespread sexual violence in both East and West Germany, targeting girls as young as 7 and women as old as 69. Many American assaults were gang assaults at gunpoint, with over a quarter of reported cases involving multiple victims. There were instances of sexual assault committed by British and Canadian troops, though the Royal Military Police tended to turn a blind eye towards abuse of German prisoners and civilians who obstructed the army. Rape was considered differently. Some officers, however, treated the behavior of their men with leniency. Some rapes were impulsively committed under the effects of alcohol or post-traumatic stress, but there were cases of premeditated attacks. One such case was the rape of 3 German women in the town of Neustadt am Rubenberger on a single day in April 1945, or the attempted sexual violence towards 2 local girls at gunpoint in the village of Oil, near Nienburg, where 2 soldiers attempted to coerce 2 girls into going into a nearby wood, and, upon their refusal, one was grabbed and dragged into the woods, where, after she began screaming, one of the soldiers pulled a gun to silence her. Whether intentionally or in error, the gun went off. The bullet struck her in the throat, killing her instantly. French troops were part of the invasion of Germany, and France was given its own occupation zone. In certain areas, such as Constance, Bruchsal, and Freudenstadt, French soldiers were reported to have committed numerous cases of sexual violence, with estimates of 385, 600, and 500 cases respectively. However, much of it has remained undocumented. French Moroccan troops were said to have behaved similarly to Soviet troops concerning sexual assault, especially in the early occupation of Baden and Württemberg. German historians from Jena and Magdeburg noted that France was the only country that supported children born from these mass assaults. In the other occupied zones, many of these children were ignored throughout their lives. Children fathered by French troops were considered French citizens, and at least 1,500 were given up for adoption in France and its colonies. Some of these occupation children faced significant social challenges, but gradually found their place in post-war Germany. The psychological trauma endured by these women was profound. Many survivors suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. The physical consequences were also devastating. Countless women contracted sexually transmitted infections, and many became pregnant. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, yet some women resorted to it out of desperation. The social stigma attached to sexual assault further compounded their suffering. In a society struggling to rebuild after the war, these women were often shunned and silenced. They were left to cope with their trauma in isolation, their stories suppressed by a nation eager to forget the horrors of the past. The legacy of the mass sexual violence committed by allies remains a painful and contentious issue. For many survivors and their families, the trauma and shame have been lifelong burdens. Efforts to document and acknowledge these atrocities are crucial for historical accuracy and for the recognition and healing of the victims. In recent years, there have been some steps towards memorializing these events. Scholarly research, documentaries, and public discussions have begun to shed light on this dark chapter. However, the process of coming to terms with this past is ongoing and fraught with challenges.